Shapiro, and we'll get to our guest in a moment. But first, let's check with the man in the booth, Jeremy. I guess, are we starting?
Yeah, fairly.
We're ready? All right, all right. Everyone turn off your phone. That's a note to myself. And great. Well, we aim to give the EU the respect they deserve by making fun of them just like anybody else. This week, we will try to figure out what the EU has been up to all summer and maybe some prognostications about the big announcements coming up from the European Commission. Right. Let's go even further. All right. We're kicking off with 3 months after European elections. The EU seems to have 2 new leaders, EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and, from Poland, EU Council President Donald Tusk. The new leaders have not announced any new agenda, but with names like Juncker and Tusk, most expect their agenda to be fighting crime and kicking ass. Outgoing EU Council President Herman van Rompuy welcomed his successor by doing his best to look like a scary bird of prey. And outgoing Commission President Manuel Barroso admitted that for years, both Barroso and Van Rompuy have looked pretty weird together, rather like a bunch of Muppets. Together, Rompuy and Barroso will now take new jobs as official EU hecklers. These leaders remind me there's nothing like a good economy, because what we've got now is nothing like a good economy. Along with Donald Tusk, the EU has a new foreign policy chief, Italy's Francesca Mogherini. With only a limited amount of of experience as Italian foreign minister, her main qualification seems to be she's not Silvio Berlusconi. Notably, Italy has done little to address the growing number of refugees flowing across Europe's southern border. Hence, Mogherini is perfect to continue Europe's policy of doing nothing to allow refugees flowing across Europe's southern border. EU foreign policy had its hands full this past weekend at the NATO summit to address Russian aggression in Ukraine. NATO was expected to take a harder stance, but they had to admit that after years of the Russian military receiving no pay, when Putin says we have no idea who invaded Ukraine, maybe he's telling the truth. Meanwhile, the initiative for the Ukraine to join NATO was struck down as founding NATO members reminded themselves the whole reason Ukraine exists is so that Russia can break off a peace whenever it gets hungry. In economic news, France recently underwent a cabinet shakeup with François Hollande saying that austerity was doing more harm than good. Angela Merkel insisted that austerity is working in Europe, pointing to the success of the UK economy after they ended austerity. Germany claims that austerity is necessary to fight inflation. Inflation that exists about as much as weapons of mass destruction in Iraq did. Yeah, that's right. Angela, I compared you to George W. Bush. Admittedly, that's not fair. Even Bush knew to eventually give up the argument. For years now, EU countries have been afraid to enact any stimulus policy that might offend Germany. But after the summer, we might be seeing some signs of change. The British have been quietly advocating stimulus. The French are more and more pro-stimulus. And after the elite economic summit in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, Mario Draghi of the European Central Bank is insisting on stimulus. But the real change in attitudes toward Germany is not just policy-based. It seems like there might be something else at work. Over the summer, Germany has announced that from now on, Europe will have to pay to drive on the Autobahn. This apparently was the straw that broke the camel's back, the drupal that made the Wasser-Emmer overflow. And as the new fiscal season opens, Europe's response to Germany is now basically enough of your austerity, your bizarre fixation on inflation, and your Autobahn. You're full of Scheiße. And I mean that in a bad way. Now, I realize I might be losing some of you. let's just take a moment and go back for a moment. Let's digest what's been going on in the headlines. Shall we check how many people had no idea that these guys were being replaced as the new leaders of Europe? And yeah, Barroso and Rompuy. It's not your fault. I mean, you'd think that if two new leaders of the second largest economy in the world were announced, it would be front page news. Not in Europe. Here's the front page of the International New York Times. No coverage of the previous weekend summit on the Monday front page. Instead, it's the all-important lead-up to the local Hong Kong elections in China. Hong Kong, very important, but local. Not China even, Hong Kong. Granted, there was a mention of the new EU leader Tusk on the front page, way down at the bottom right. There he is. Yes, there he is. Normally, it's referred to in headline, front page layout terminology as the who gives a shit territory. Normally devoted to headlines such as opera singer introduces new fragrance or those green golf jackets. Who makes them? And granted, they did cover the story in the business section on page 17 without even including a picture of the new leader. That's the equivalent of like the first ever black president being elected in America, and the newspaper runs no picture of the man, just a picture of George Bush saying proud leader looks back on legacy. Whereas the new guy, the old guy is Hans van Rompuy, whose most notable moment was allowing UK right-wing politician Nigel Farage to say, "You should not exist. You have all the charisma of a damp rag." Now, the incoming EU Council president, I think, is rather noteworthy. Kind of a tough-talking guy, Donald Tusk. If Nigel Farage calls Donald Tusk a damp rag, I can imagine Tusk might say, "I'll show you who's a damp rag," and wipe the floor with him. Now, if you, like many people, say, it doesn't matter how we vote, they just pick whoever they like, it's not entirely your fault. You're partly right. There was a point when the democratically elected Juncker was being opposed by David Cameron of the UK, who was shouted down in a major political embarrassment for Cameron. Didn't read about that, did you? No, it was on page 17. If, like you say, like many people say, I guess it's just not that interesting, it's not your fault. The fact that Tusk is from Poland, right on the border with Russia, could be interesting for this whole Ukraine situation. Nah, you only read about that somewhere on page 17. Or maybe it was in the next day's paper, the Tuesday edition. But no, still no mention of the front page here on the front page. It's like, couldn't they just have a special section devoted to the EU? But no, there is a special section. It does include an entire section about Russia. Written by Russia, paid for by Russia. Hey, EU, we are not saying your new anti-Russian Council President Tusk is not important. We're just feeling we would feel more comfortable if he was not placed so prominently in your newspaper. And hey, EU, if you want to get your story in the paper, it helps to give them a little incentive.